Thank you very much, Nadine, and what a pleasure it is to be here with you tonight to introduce Dr. Rosalind Hackett. And thank you all for coming, as Nadine has already expressed. I am so pleased to welcome you, Dr. Rosalind Hackett, to speak at our Lectures in Catholic Experience at St. Jerome's University as part of this year's Waterloo District Catholic School Board lecture. Dr. Hackett is professor and head of the Religious Studies Department, an adjunct professor in anthropology, and associate faculty member at the Baker Center for Public Policy, all at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Her earned degrees and qualifications include her PhD in Religious Studies from Scotland's University of Aberdeen, her Master's of Philosophy in Religious Studies from the University of London, a postgraduate certificate in education from University of Exeter, and her bachelor's degree in French and Religious Studies from University of Leeds. So that's quite a pile of qualifications for tonight's presentation. An impressive array of field experience contributes to Dr. Hackett's knowledge and expertise in the events of northern Uganda, particularly in relation to the fallout from many years of war in that region and the ongoing impact of the particular trauma through which Ugandans have lived. Early in her career, Dr. Hackett spent 9 years teaching and researching in Africa, especially Nigeria. She has also had research trips to Dahomey, in the Republic of Benin, and in Cameroon. Additional field work was conducted in Liberia and Ghana, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Senegal, and Botswana. By no means is this all the countries in Africa, but she has certainly studied the significant representation of them. As well, Dr. Hackett had a stint doing field work on African churches in London and the United States, as well as in Asia. In addition to an extensive number of scholarly activities, chapters, journals, conferences, presentations, and reports to which Dr. Hackett has contributed, she has also edited 6 books and authored 3. Dr. Hackett has also embraced activism in support of Ugandan women and children by founding and coordinating the Jazz for Justice project and the Gulu Study and Service Abroad program. Jazz for Justice strives to explore music and arts as tools for peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. The Gulu Study and Service Abroad program combines academics with internships in order to facilitate learning while allowing students to work with individuals and groups who are promoting peace and development in this war-affected region of Africa. This evening, Dr. Hackett will be speaking on response to post-conflict northern Uganda's social suffering, a topic with which she is extensively familiar and eminently qualified to expand upon for us. To quote Dr. Hackett from her 2004 work entitled, "Who Goes to Gulu?" Dr. Hackett says, and I quote, "One African proverb kept resounding in my head, also cited by Archbishop Odama. When 2 elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. The trampling of the people of northern Uganda, notably the children, youth, and women, is a blight upon the country, upon the continent, as well as our shared humanity." End of quote. So today we are so pleased that Dr. Hackett will share her special insights with us into the responses to this trampling that are happening and that still need to happen for the future success of northern Uganda. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosalind Hackett.
Thank you very much for an extremely thoughtful and beautifully crafted introduction. And I'd like to thank the President and Vice President and Academic Dean for the invitation to speak this evening. and with a special thank you to Nadine Collins for all that she's done to get me here and understand what I'm doing and whom I'm speaking to. So thank you, Nadine. You're a great organizer and hustler. I'm no stranger to Canada, but I am a stranger to Waterloo. So this is my first contact with your area. And happy to make the acquaintance of some of the students. And so thank you once again for the invitation. Now, I've chosen to speak on a topic that is not only central to my work as a researcher and as a teacher and as an activist and as an administrator, but also dear to my heart as a concerned global citizen and a committed Africanist. I also consider that the topic that I've chosen is appropriate for your institution as one that aims to inculcate both learning and a spirit of service in its students. The advantage of the focus that I've chosen is that it will also allow me to impart some information to hopefully increase your knowledge and awareness of the issues involved in this war-torn region of northern Uganda, but also weave in some of my own reflections on my learning curve as well as that of my colleagues and students. As we have sought to understand this tragic civil conflict and subsequent, what I call social suffering, as well as the dilemmas involved in rebuilding the lives of individuals and communities. Now, I've got the plan for this evening's talk is I've got a lot of, about 30 slides with some very powerful images, and I'm just going to talk around those. I haven't got a lot of a lot of text, a lot of images that I will comment on, and we have a couple of video clips that I hope we can get to work. Now, I begin, my first slide has a focus on youth, because it is the youth who have been really most affected by this 20-year-old civil war, because they were the ones who were abducted. They were the ones whose lives got disrupted, whose education was disrupted. So the top slide actually shows what we call the night commuter children, who had to leave their villages every evening and walk into town. Often hundreds and thousands of them at a time would be sleeping, for example, within the compound of the Catholic cathedral there, or the hospital, or on the sort of veranda, the shops. So they came to town each night to sleep, and then they'd get up very early in the morning and walk back to their villages and go to school and farm. So that's from the days of the conflict. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, this is a much more positive image of some of the young people who were abductees, and with my students last summer who took them out for socializing. So all of these young people, the young men especially, were abducted, and they came back and they're trying to get their education restored. So it was a great moment for them to be able to socialize and enjoy the company of fellow young people from another part of the world. Now, just a quick geographic note. Here is Uganda, and the town that I'm going to be talking about is the town of Gulu. It's about 4 hours directly north from the capital capital Kampala, and here is where Uganda landlocked beneath Sudan. That's significant. Ethiopia, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's Lake Victoria. So this is the area we're going to be talking about. This was the center of the war, this region, and this town was the center of all humanitarian activity. Now, you stole my thunder in that you mentioned the piece that I wrote as a result of going to northern Uganda in 2004. I would never have got there if because actually I'm really an expert on Nigeria, but I had a wonderful year at the University of Notre Dame at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies in 2003-2004. As luck or providence would have it, they decided that they were going to have their annual conference in Uganda, in Jinja. And so I was able to go to Uganda, and a friend of mine from the north of the country whisked me up to the north, somewhat secretively, because the war was still on. I didn't even tell my family, I didn't tell my colleagues that I was going up there, because I had heard about the war, partly because the rebel group had all sorts of intriguing religious dimensions. So I'd read about some of the prophetic activity, the spirit possession, and I wanted to know more. But these are two of the images that I took while I was there. And this is a rainy day in one of the largest camps, the displaced person camps. 66,000 people lived in this camp. The conditions were horrendous. Then the next day I was taken to the barracks and introduced to these children who had been rescued the day before. And this boy was feral. I mean, he had been born in the bush and reared in the bush. So I agonized over whether to take their photo. I felt I was, I didn't want to be, it was sort of voyeurism to I'm going to take a picture of rescued child soldiers, but then in a split second I decided to take it because I thought if I shared it I might be able to do some good. But these were then taken off, these boys were taken off by World Vision, and then had a 2-week sort of debriefing, rehabilitation, and then they were given some money and then sort of basically let loose. Or some of them would be taken into the army, like this one, sort of conscripted into the army. So all in all, I mean, I haven't got time to tell you about all the experience I had in just 8 days up in the north. I met with political leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, child soldiers, taken to the camps. I mean, it was one of the most, or probably the most powerful, life-transforming week of my life. I had never seen such human suffering in my life in 1 week. And then the despair of people, because they felt so neglected and they felt so forgotten. This was near the end of the war, we didn't know that then, but people were saying, why doesn't anybody care? Why doesn't anybody come and visit us? I mean, nobody really of any importance had been up to the north of the country in order to see what was going on. Interestingly, the U.S. government officials could not go up there because of the security alert. So actually somebody from the embassy used my photos in order to share. I am happy to tell you, though, that one of the first diplomats to come to the north of Uganda was a Canadian. I think it's Lloyd Axworthy, right? He was one of the first, and then somebody highly placed in the British government came, and then the floodgates sort of opened and people started to come. But including some celebrities that I will show later. But as I left, I said to Archbishop Odama, I'm going to talk about him in a minute, this now internationally renowned Catholic Archbishop who's done so much to publicize this human tragedy. I said, Your Grace, what can I do as a mere academic going back to my life of comfort at the University of Tennessee? And he said, just please go back and tell people what you have seen and what you have heard. So when I got back to, actually I was going back to Notre Dame, I worked with the public relations officer to craft this piece that would be on the internet and to do my bit to try to publicize what I had seen. And I swore to myself that from that day onwards, after I had come from there, I would never forget and do whatever I could every day to help and work with the people of northern Uganda. Now, I'm going to, this looks very ambitious, but don't get alarmed because I will go quickly through some of these subheadings, and if there are any that interest you in particular, we can revisit them during question time. Now, I'm going to give you just a very quick outline of the history, because history is so important. You cannot understand the war if you don't understand the history, and this is still amazing to myself and my students to find people, outsiders in northern Uganda, whether they're missionaries or aid workers, who have no sense of the history of this conflict. All right, but my main focus for the talk is to lay out the variety of responses to this conflict, to this war, to this insurgency. It's interesting how, which you have to note the terms that people use to refer to it. I think in my academic community would most commonly refer to it as a civil war, to a conflict. The government of Uganda would only really refer to it as a rebellion or as an insurgency, sort of minimizing the significance of it. Acholi people, the people from this region who live in the diaspora, actually are more radical, and they refer to it as a genocide. So we could get onto that later, but labeling is important. It can be empowering or disempowering. So I'm going to go, still not used to using the buttons, sorry. I'm going to go through these range of responses to convey to you, particularly the students, about the different approaches you could have if you wanted to intervene or try to work to eliminate conflict and bring about peace and development. So, as I said, I'm really also wanting to share with you some of our learning curve on this and how we underestimated the complexity and the problematic of which one of these you choose and whether you might ignore the others. Now there is some overlap. You know, of course there are musicians who are very politically motivated, but so these are somewhat artificial distinctions, but I hope you'll get my point. And then I'll end with an update, because it's still very much in the news, even though the conflict has officially ended. Now, you know, wars are always about people, and so I chose to highlight some of the key players in the history of the conflict. Really should begin down here, well, here and here, in the mid to late 80s. There were a series of rebel movements that rose up to overthrow, in the wake of Idi Amin, to overthrow the government of the day, and President Museveni, as he now is, was one of those rebel leaders who eventually became president. Now, unfortunately, and I can't get into the complexities of this, there were a series of incidents where people from his ethnic group were massacred in a conflict with people from the north. And one of the rebel movements that was led by a woman, which is interesting in and of itself, by the name of Alice Alma, who eventually became known as Alice Aquino. This is from a book about her. There aren't many photographs of her. This is probably one of the best for showing you. And she claimed to be possessed by local cultural spirits, and she led a rebel movement to try to effect a revival, to cleanse her people and to resist the sort of ethnic and political domination of people from the south. Now, she eventually faded out in 1988, and her cousin or relative, Joseph Konya, that's spelled K-O-N-Y, but it's actually pronounced Konya, he took over the reins of the movement and rebuilt a rebel movement that unfortunately became much more violent, as we shall see in the 1990s. And he is still on the loose. He's Africa's most wanted war criminal. He's no longer in Uganda. He's probably in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then this war also involves actors from Sudan. Remember, Sudan's right above. And the government of Sudan in the north supported the rebels to get back at President Museveni, and President Museveni was being sort of very irritated and angry at the government support for the rebels. So in other words, what appears to be a local civil war actually has all sorts of international ramifications, and then the US started intervening and actually drawing up bills in Congress in relation to northern Uganda from 2004 onwards. So there have been a series of those. Now, the statistics, while they vary a little, but I think I chose some of the most reliable ones, but they're pretty awful. At least 100,000 people killed between 86 and 2007, 66,000 people, youth, abducted, and 30,000 children from that period, and probably only a half, we think, have been found or returned. There's still a few at large, but so many, there are still many missing. And then about 80 to 90% of the population were displaced off their lands. That's nearly 2 million people forced off their farmlands into these dreadful camps, probably from about the 1990s onwards. Most of them have been shut down and people have now gone back to their land. But those are pretty horrifying statistics. But let me just, before we leave this statistics page, I just want to make sure that you've noted the dates. This is a 20-year-old civil war. One of the reasons that this war was so neglected is that it has happened over a long period of time. It's what we call a dirty war, right? It's low level, low intensity, with sort of terrorist activity, not the sort of explosive genocide that happened in Rwanda, right? That just ignited the world press, or what happened in Darfur, right? In Sudan, again, very intense in a very short period of time. So this is part of the problem, that low-level activity over 20 years, which isn't sensationalist enough for the world media. Now, those involved in humanitarian activity were, of course, among the first to go there, particularly whether it was the World Food Program or Catholic Relief Services or Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders. And I mean, here you see the huge operations that were involved in feeding these people in camps. I went once with the Norwegian Refugee Council to one of the camps and watched them sort of doing a weekly distribution of rations. I mean, it's one of the most demeaning activities I've ever seen. People didn't even have names, they just had numbers. They sort of come and get cups of rice. It was awful. And so here you see, this is a typical image of one of these camps, we call IDP camps, internally displaced camps. You see how closely the huts placed together. This was a real problem because it led to fighting. People never lived this close together in villages. And also the huts would catch fire and the fire would spread across the roof. So within, it just would take one fire and hundreds of huts could be destroyed. This is a great image, showing where the aid was coming from. This created terrible aid dependency. People became, they no longer would farm because the food was just brought to them. So that created all sorts of problems. Believe it or not, when the time came to move people out of these camps, a lot of people did not want to leave because, so that's how controversial some of these food aid programs were. And here's a picture, if you arrive in the town of Gulu, this is just a sample of some of the signboards. I mean, I've never seen so many aid agency signboards in my life. And at the height of the war, there were, I'm told that there were nearly 300, maybe between 200 and 300 aid agencies based in this small town. And a higher concentration there than in any other part of Africa. It was actually quite dangerous walking around. We did not have one of these powerful vehicles that these humanitarian agencies had. So we were just walking around the streets, but you had to be very careful because they could knock you over, because they were used to driving fast to avoid the rebels. So, political responses. I mean, one has to understand the politics of all of this. I mean, the reason that the rebel activity began and was sustained was precisely because of processes of marginalization on the part of the central government, and in terms of distribution of resources, or all sorts of other strategies for marginalizing the area. So this is a great quote from a very respected organization in Washington, D.C., saying that under the current president, Uganda's made a remarkable recovery from the horrors that the country experienced under the late dictator Idi Amin. However, much of northern Uganda remained marginalized and neglected. It is this sense of marginalization that has helped spawn the rebel movements, the most serious of which is the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA, right? So that's, we're going to hear more on them. So then you would see, if you went to Gulu, that there's a lot of human rights organizations there. If you did a search on the internet, you would see that there's been lots of reports by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, often on the issue of abduction of children, children's rights, abuse of women. So here you have one women's organization demonstrating on behalf of women, protesting violence against women, because, by the way, the violence against the women has not ceased with the war ending, because the violence has become almost endemic because of the poverty and because of the people not being able to manage the conflicts. So there's a lot of there's still a lot of peace building work and development work that needs to be done. So now, this is one of the areas that has interested me as a scholar of religion. And as I told you, not just the fact that the main rebel group is called the Lord's Resistance Army, and they have this this stated goal of wanting to restore the they use religious language, but they're very eclectic. Some traditional religions, some Christianity, some Islam. But what's interesting here is the way that religious leaders have really taken a stand and provided great leadership in trying to bring an end to the war and in trying to sort of redress the imbalance in the country. Now, here's the two main actors in this religious leaders' peace initiative. Remember, they're the Acholi people. That's the main people in the north of the country. So this is Archbishop John Baptist Odama, and then this is retired Anglican Bishop Baker Ochola. They are the founders of this organization, and that we work very closely with them. They're two of the greatest human beings that I have ever known, and very courageous. And they went often into the bush to try to negotiate with the rebels. to try to rescue the children. I mean, they put their own lives on the line to try to bring peace back to their region. So, and they have been rewarded for that. They've won several international peace awards, which unfortunately has got them into trouble because then the government said, look at these religious leaders going off around the world, getting lots of money and becoming rich. So there are all sorts of jealousies and unfortunate exchanges, but they are two wonderful human beings. And Bishop Ochola, who is very much from the north, his own wife was blown up by a landmine, and one of his daughters was abducted by the rebels. She was rescued. She was group raped. She was eventually rescued, but then she committed suicide. So this is a man who has turned swords into plowshares. I mean, he has become such a role model, and he's retired. I mean, he's 76 and he's as strong as an ox, so we try to support him as much as possible. He's a great storyteller and really believes in, I'm going to say a bit more about him in a minute in relation to traditional culture. And here's a scene from one of the, this is Archbishop Odama, did so much to help these night commuter children who used to sleep like sardines in these tents or on these verandas each night in order to avoid being abducted. Now, I'd love to say more about this organization, this non-governmental organization that they created, the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, because it's very interesting how this has evolved. It is now a really very elaborate, quite influential organization that isn't just about getting religious leaders together to talk about peace, but you can see from just their different activities here, and I'm going to show you. So look, they do a lot trying to get the fighters to give up their arms, but they even they write letters to President Obama, and I mean they're amazingly bold now, and they do a lot on land disputes, land conflict. That is one of the biggest problems facing the people of northern Uganda, is how to sort out the land wrangles. So if you're interested, you should go and look at their website. And they're also very much in favor of using traditional rituals of reconciliation. And a quick note that this group was founded by Catholics and Anglicans and the Muslims, and other Christian groups would not join them. The other Protestant groups have only just joined this organization. So I find it very interesting that the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Muslims work together, and then gradually the others have come in. They also work with traditional leaders a bit too. Now, one of our students last year, when she actually got to Uganda, we get our students, of course, to read a lot in advance, but she said that she never realized how important was the legal dimensions of this conflict and all the legal interventions, which are actually pretty current, because in 2005, the newly constituted International Criminal Court unfortunately chose northern Uganda as their first case. And this was much contested by the people of northern Uganda, saying This will just worsen the conflict. There'll be no amnesty, and they strongly condemned it, but they basically were not consulted. This decision to make this an international war crimes issue was done in conjunction with President Museveni. So this has been very, very problematic. And then just last year, look, the African Union formally designated as a terrorist group the Lord's Resistance Army. There's just one problem, though. The US also designated the Lord's Resistance Army as a terrorist group. The problem is when you designate a group as a terrorist, you can no longer negotiate with them. You can't talk peace with them. You only then are really motivated to go after them militarily. But as the Archbishop keeps on saying, but the Lord's Resistance Army, most of the young people in the ranks, there are children. That's what he keeps on saying, there are children. So this was a trial that was going on when we were there last year, very controversial trial involving a mid-ranking rebel leader, and it was going to be a model trial, but it's somewhat fallen apart. So, okay. Now, I'm very interested in the role of the media. A lot of people overlook the role of the media, and I just want to say a couple of things about the media. The media are not innocent, ever, and they are certainly not innocent in terms of shaping the course of this 20-year-old civil war. For a long time, the government newspaper in Uganda, the New Vision, basically didn't even cover what was going on in the north. And then, or sometimes they've had headlines like this, which were often unsubstantiated or exaggerated. Then they put very sensationalist pictures on the front cover, and they never reported any atrocities that might have been committed by the government troops. But there was a Catholic priest there, an Italian, a Comboni father, who really did a lot of reporting to counter some of these headlines. But then you have the example of this wonderful radio station set up called Mega FM, right in the center of Gulu, and they would broadcast programs that could be heard in the camps and could be heard by the rebels. And sometimes the rebels would call in on their satellite phones into this program. So you'd have these amazing interactions via this radio station. So that would make, I hope somebody's going to write a book or a PhD thesis on the role that this radio station has played in the war. And then sometimes, amazing, you can get much better reporting in the international press, such as, this is my favorite newspaper in Britain, The Guardian. I mean, look at this sort of a long article from 2009 on the rebel leader. I mean, really sort of in-depth ethnographic reporting, as opposed to sort of sensationalist reporting. So now, many of my students are particularly interested in the community responses to the social suffering of the Acholi people. And there are all sorts of very, very interesting projects that are springing up particularly in the rural areas. We went to visit the site of this massacre. This is about 56 people were massacred after the government troops who were there, supposed to be there to protect them, ran away, and the rebels came in and just massacred. So the people in this village very kindly told us the story of this massacre and also what they were trying to do through creating a survivor association. They want to have a museum there. They want one of our students to go and intern at this museum. I don't know if any of you have been to the Holocaust Museum. So it would be, how do you commemorate, how do you memorialize these negative moments of your history? Do you forget and move on, or how do you do it? So they're still in the process of trying to think through how to, and maybe how to use some sort of memorialization project that could be income generating. So it is a privilege to be there and be with them as they think through some of this and actually use us as a sounding board. Would we come and visit if they came and did something like that? So there's all sorts of community rebuilding projects, and then lots of emphasis on peace education and reconciliation. One of my students is doing a project on actually studying peace education initiatives in the schools. Are they actually doing any good? That sort of thing. Now, of particular interest are the initiatives of local community leaders, particularly Bishop Achola. Even though he's a Christian leader, is so pro traditional culture and strongly believing that his own culture has the resources, particularly through this mechanism called Matahoput, which is a reconciliation ritual whereby the two aggrieved parties come together and drink something very bitter, and then there are various stages. They break an egg, they drink something bitter, and then they reconcile. The communities reconcile. But there are many people who are critical of this initiative to try to use traditional restorative justice because they say that it is it's too limited to deal with these major crimes against humanity. That you need international justice mechanisms to deal with that sort of scale. Now, there have been similar debates in Rwanda too. And interestingly, it is the community courts that have succeeded, the Gacaca courts, more than the more Western-style justice system. So again, we had students there, some graduate students who were working on transitional justice projects, and for them it's absolutely fascinating hearing the ongoing debates and discussion over whether, should it be peace and forgiveness first and then justice, or do you go for justice first and hope that peace follows? So these are very live issues. I've just noticed there's one white person there photographing that. We're very trying to be as savvy as possible and not be naive disaster tourists, as they're called. There are people that we have encountered in the north who are just there for that reason. Okay, now this is where I need to actually. Let me just say a word, and then I hope this link will work so that we can activate this quick dance. This is several, particularly some of the international agencies, have underestimated the power of culture to help restore communities and rebuild people's lives. So we've tried to be very attentive to that, and one of my students interned in this organization that is trying to restore traditional dances and drumming and music as a means of community rebuilding. So some aid agencies use culture and dances, but as just very supplementary. But there are some, such as ourselves, who really see culture as a very powerful tool. Okay, let's see if we can get that linked. No, there's another one. How many of you have heard of or seen this film, War Dance? Okay, a few. This brilliant film has probably done more to make the case that culture matters. Highly, highly recommended. And all sorts of awards, and deservedly so. So let's, I think I've got, right, that's the, nope. Takes a second to get in.
Competition, my dear, back in Uganda.
There's a very small chance for a school like Patong to get to the national music competition.
When you play this album, the whole choristers here depends on you.
With a big smile, see?
We are still able to be the best. The festival has started.
I know what the answer
I'd like to also emphasize the role of music. That is how, when I got back to my home base, I was inspired by the Sierra Leonean refugee all-stars, if you ever come across them, how they took their message of war and suffering and turned that around through music. So I and some students and some musicians created a project called the Jazz for Justice Project, healing war-torn northern Uganda through the power of music activism. And so we've worked with local musicians such as this one here, Jeff Corondo, to help produce his CDs, and one of my students created another organization called Music for Peace, and then we held jazz concerts in Knoxville, Tennessee, to raise money to help support some of these after-school programs, or actually this was one called Heals in northern Uganda, in Gulu. So here, these are very famous musicians. Kirk Whalum, known as the king of gospel jazz. Jeff Coffin, who now plays saxophone for the Dave Matthews Band. And then I was telling everyone at dinner about this South African jazz musicians in Kawana who also played. So this was an incredible moment when they played together for this. So we have seen and heard in northern Uganda how much music matters to people, particularly young people, and this is something that doesn't always get supported. And then art. I put this word here with some hesitation because someone jumped on us one day, said, you can't do art therapy, you're not qualified, you know that, and it's true that it sounds as if by working with young people and getting them to draw and paint, that somehow you're the ones who are healing them. So he objected to the term therapy, but it does exist as a concept, so I did put it there. But this is my student who, this was her undergraduate honors thesis that she turned into this amazing book with the focus on creative approaches to peace and healing. And she's now living in northern Uganda, working for an organization there. So, you know, she's so inspiring that undergraduates can do big things. So this is another area that is interesting to watch, the area that I would call cultural revival. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Watoto Children's Choir. Hand up if you've heard about the Watoto or if you've seen it, right. Well, this is it's a choir of children from Uganda that tours the world. And the church was actually begun by a Canadian couple who still live in Kampala, the capital. And so they have these incredible projects to take culture, Ugandan culture, and sort of market it, so to support their projects, which are often to do with orphans and vulnerable women. So they have jewelry projects like this, recycled paper beads made by women. I happen to be wearing one of their necklaces. And so you can, if you came to northern Uganda, you'd see there's lots of these projects springing up to provide livelihood for women. So, you know, that's another angle on the rebuilding process. Photography. I decided not to include too many shocking photos, but this is I think she's a New York-based photographer who went to northern Uganda and spent some time there and created this incredible exhibition of very powerful photos. And she came to Knoxville and exhibited her work, and my students and I had very mixed feelings about her photography. We somehow thought that it verged just a little too much on the sensational side. I mean, so again, this is an interesting area to debate. You know, how do you represent people's suffering in order to help them in rebuilding their lives and forgetting and forgiving and all of that? So these are people who were burned in one of those campfires. Yeah. But there are worse photos than that. So I mean that's something we could discuss. All right, now for some time Northern Uganda did not have any celebrities going there. Darfur had George Clooney. George Clooney did so much for Darfur. And but then Don Cheadle and his family went and actually lived in one of those camps for some time. And they also walked the walk of the children, the night commuters. He got his children to walk barefoot. Now, of course, you could say that's a publicity stunt, but it certainly brings attention to the plight of people. So again, that's something else to debate. But a lot of the, support and intervention, unfortunately, can be strongly influenced by what the attention that celebrities give to particular areas of the world. So here, I don't know how many of you are fans of Uma Thurman, but there is the film. There's a film coming out of South Africa I think it's coming out in June this year, and it's, gosh, I've forgotten what the title is going to be, but it's about an abduction of about 100 girls from a boarding school. It's known as the Aboke girls, right? In 1996. And there was a nun who ran after them and stuck with them and argued with the rebels, and she became famous, and in the end she negotiated the release of many of these girls. Some still did die. So it's going to be very interesting how this film comes out, and I don't know how much of it was actually filmed in Uganda, just some. I think a lot of it was filmed in South Africa, so this will be, but isn't the title's a little bit offensive, isn't it? Hollywood to tackle Uganda rebels. No, perhaps the organization that has done the most to bring the world's attention, particularly the attention of the youth, especially in North America, to this war and the suffering of the young people, and that is this organization known as Invisible Children. How many of you have heard of Invisible Children? All right. Now, started by 3 students, filmmakers, who got lost, they claim, trying to go to Sudan, and they ended up in northern Uganda and discovered that there was a war there and decided that they would film it, and their film became very successful and went all around college campuses, high schools, and they got a lot of support, a lot of money, and they have a very powerful publicity machine, a most impressive website, and but not uncontroversial, because they put a lot of emphasis on child soldiers, the boys, to the exclusion of the girls who were abducted. Some girls became child soldiers and were involved in fighting, but many of them were sex slaves and became wives of the rebel leaders. So they were criticized for putting too much emphasis on sort of the sexiness of war, and also, I hope I'm not offending any devotees of invisible children here, but I mean, if you even just take a look at their website now, you hardly ever see a picture where they are not in the picture. I mean, that says something, but they were very naive politically to begin with. I know it upset my students when they came to, they had all these teams that toured around the United States, and they came to our campus, one of the teams, and my students, the Justice students, went and saw the film. I mean, the early film was very controversial too. My students put their hands up and said, wait, but you didn't say anything about the history of the conflict, and you haven't mentioned the politics, and you haven't mentioned the role of the government. They didn't have answers. But now they've become much more informed, and now they work with well-established lobbying groups in Washington, such as Resolve, and they work they've done a lot to move forward U.S. policy on northern Uganda. So that evolution is commendable. Let's not forget academic responses. Academics are not innocent in all of this, and PhD theses and books can also have quite considerable impact. Many northern Ugandans absolutely love this book by a Swedish anthropologist, Sverker Finström, who lived for a year or two in Gulu during about 2000-2001 and did his PhD on sort of this thing, how people coped during the war. It's a brilliant ethnography turned into a book, and it's an absolute must read, because it really gets at the sort of texture and substance of everyday life in a war-torn situation. So, and many northern Ugandans applaud it for its veracity. And then, so that's a must-read for our students. This one too is extremely good. That came out about a year or so ago. And this one, I'll try to do them in the order. That's right. Here's another one by a British author called Social Torture, which is good. Now this one, sorry, it's such a lousy picture, but this is now going to be the book that is really going to shake things up, called Displacing Human Rights, War and Intervention in Northern Uganda. This is a political scientist. This came out. He is highly critical of most forms of intervention, particularly humanitarian, human rights, international legal interventions, and it's a really brilliant but very radical critique. So anyone, any students who are interested in these issues, you absolutely must read this book. You may not like a lot of what he says. I mean, he's very hard-hitting, and this is it's going to make people rethink a lot of the intervention that goes on in these in Africa's conflicts. His main argument is, and it's a very valid one, that that these interventions often displace or sort of, how should I put it, render ineffective any local community responses of rebuilding and of peace building, because people become dependent on international intervention because the internationals have more money, they come with more symbolic power. So he said that it has created a negative dependency and everything. So I haven't got time to say more than that. This just came out too. I think this is going to be highly regarded. Reimagining Child Soldiers in International Law and Policy. Now this is again a very, very controversial area. When a child is abducted in a rebel war, and the child, in order to save its own life, is forced to kill others, maybe kill members of its own family. The child is turned into a killing machine. At what point does the child cease to be innocent and become guilty? At what point does a child soldier become subject to criminal law? I mean, when does the innocence stop and the guilt begin? So you see, Archbishop Udama wants to believe that all of these children who are abducted, even though they committed horrific crimes, that they should be forgiven and that amnesty should be given. But there are a lot of people that do not agree with that. So this sort of debate is still going on in the community. I'm almost at the end. And this is just to say very quickly about our project. I'm very happy to meet the students here who are going to Uganda this summer, and I do hope that even if you're in the Kampala area, you still go up north and maybe come and visit us. So there's really nothing that beats context-specific learning, being there in the field, and as the wonderful Paul Farmer says, don't just study suffering, do something about it. And that's our program. And very quickly, just some of the updates. It's become a much more regional issue with the Lord's Resistance Army sort of moving into Central Africa. They used to be in Southern Sudan, now they moved into Central Africa. And recently, President Obama signed a bill which provides funds for the U.S. Africa Command to send about 100 experts in to try to catch the rebel group. But they haven't succeeded yet, which some people find absolutely amazing. Given all modern technology, how can a few hundred, perhaps a few thousand rebels keep on evading the government army as well as now this international elite force? So you can understand why many northern Ugandans believe that there is complicity on the part of the government in not wanting to end this war. So so right now, Archbishop Odama would say that we are enjoying an uneasy peace. And many people say that they won't be able to sleep really peacefully at night until the rebels are sort of apprehended and secured, or whatever happens. So here's this is from the Invisible Children website. They have incredible images, and they have developed this. This is very interesting if you want sort of an up-to-date, this LRA crisis tracker. It is tracking the activities of the rebel groups as they move through. I'm not sure what I think about that, but again, that's what they call it. And then here, this is their current project, Kenya 2012, Stop at Nothing. So it is amazing how the publicity, the initiatives, and what was once this neglected, forgotten civil war is now on the international stage. But I'm happy to say that the town of Gulu is experiencing some development, some peace. It's known as a boom town now, and it's quite peaceful at night. I actually feel safer walking around there than walking around Knoxville, Tennessee at night. But again, until Joseph Kanya is captured, there won't be a full peace. And even then, some people say there'll still be other rebels that will come up until there's a national reconciliation process and some sort of national amnesty. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry it was so complex, but I think that's what I wanted to convey, that there's so many angles on this, and you need to have some sense of how it has evolved, and even how the groups involved themselves have evolved. Thank you very much for your attention.
If anyone has any questions, I just ask you to move to one of the microphones on either side, because we are recording it this evening, and it makes it a lot better for recording if you can actually hear your question. Anybody have anything they want to explore further? I thought some of the students might have a couple of areas.
Yeah, so my question was, when you're talking about invisible children, you were mentioning how they seem to oversimplify the conflict.
But they have to...
I'll just talk this way. And yeah, so they seem to be oversimplifying the conflict.
They were.
Yeah, they were oversimplifying the conflict. And then you were sort of talking about celebrity awareness of these issues. And so I was wondering where the balance is between oversimplification but getting people to become aware. Because I feel that you have to make it somewhat simple so that people catch on to it. I mean, that's sort of what George Clooney did with what he was doing in Sudan. So I was wondering where you draw that line.
That's a brilliant question. I'm very impressed. I think you can do both, and you need the right people, and you often need money to do it. You need excellent public relations, and you need the taglines, you need the images, but then you need to also have available the history of the conflict, the timeline. So, if you looked at the early versions of Invisible Children's website, there was no history, right? Now there's a good history. Now there's the politics and it's kind of out of balance. So they are brilliant at finding images and campaign messages. So and also Resolve, it used to be called Resolve Uganda, which, by the way, was begun by undergraduates at Notre Dame. They they've always been more serious and academic and wanting to provide substance and serve as a resource. So, I mean, I think you have to look at the mission statement of each organization. And what is interesting is the way that the organizations partner with each other in order to be more effective. You know, who will partner with who, but not. So, but I think you're absolutely right. You've got to have a strong, clear message. You've got to have someone who can take the message out, and then, but you also must, to be respectful of the culture and the history of the people. You need to provide the substance. I mean, that's what was very offensive to a lot of my northern Ugandan friends, is the way that it was oversimplified, or that they weren't even consulted. I mean, that was part of the problem with the first Invisible Children film, that the wrong people were the talking heads. The Archbishop Rudama, who's been so involved with this, right from the beginning, was just a small image and just got a few seconds, whereas some young, white, male aid worker was the one who was being interviewed the most. I mean, that was culturally insensitive. And this film ran around for months and months and months, and nobody corrected it. Now, I haven't seen the latest one, but I think they heard some of the critiques. So, yeah, that's a great point, but it's not easy to do. Some of the images can be problematic. Which images do you choose? There was one very problematic image that Invisible Children used that my students got very upset about and took on Invisible Children for. It was, I don't know if you remember it, it was appealing to high school students. It had like a teddy bear backpack and carrying an AK-47. I mean, sort of, it was just, so, but they have a brilliant machine. I'm in awe of their website and their images. But anyway, great question, and there's no easy answers, right? Well, I would say one of the real benefits that I and my students have had in working on all of this is actually thinking through these questions. What words do you use? How do you represent? How do you reach people who didn't know about this war and basically think that they don't need to know about it or don't care? So we had to find the ways to reach people in our community to get interested and to get involved. And one of them was that, how about that millions of your tax dollars are going to support the Ugandan army? So, some people, sometimes you need facts like that, not your tax dollars, US tax dollars, I don't know. Yes, you need facts, you need how much shock treatment do you, it's a great question, yes.
I was wondering what you think the role of faith-based organizations are in areas of conflict, because they could take, an offensive stance, a defensive stance. They could just be there as support for the community. Where do you see that role played out in conflict?
Another good question. I think, let me begin with a positive answer, and then I'll give you a negative one. Because there's no easy answer to that either. The positive example that I give, you'll be pleased to know, is that of the Catholic Church, which of course is like the world's largest social movement and happens to be powerful in northern Uganda. So a ready-made network of priests and parishes and church workers who A, could provide humanitarian relief, and B, information on the atrocities that were being committed. This one Italian Catholic priest in particular, and actually he's just written a book about his experiences, he was a major source of information on what was happening on the ground and publicizing internationally those statistics in order to challenge some of the media and government statistics. So there's an example. He's at the Camboni Fathers, and he was of how a faith-based organization almost did more than just provide welfare and relief. Now, some people may find that problematic, and of course, the president is quick to criticize religious organizations for getting too political or being too prophetic, if you like, saying, you're religious, just tend to your flocks and leave us to governing and to politics. Well, of course, it's not as simple as that. A negative example would be that, referring back to my point about who will work together and who won't, when I first went there in 2004, some of the Pentecostal and evangelical groups did not want to work with any of the other religious organizations, either on peace building or any humanitarian work. They only wanted to do their own thing, and they wanted to do it through exorcism, and they had their own ways of doing it. They wouldn't collaborate in any way. That has changed some, but in other words, that a sort of an exclusivist approach to your own, in terms of your own religious organization and your own methodology for dealing with this, could be limited in effectiveness and actually even counterproductive. I don't. Some, of course, are accused of saying that they wouldn't give assistance unless you converted, but I haven't got hard evidence of that. But that does go on, of course. We know that is the case, and not just Christian organizations, Muslim organizations, but and also it depends on your definition of a faith-based organization. I mean, they vary enormously, but it's an important area to look at, and it can be problematic because it means that if a faith-based organization is too faith-oriented, then they won't get support or money from people who are not of that faith. So, you can win and lose. But it's an area that is, believe it or not, is only just starting to be studied. There's now some young anthropologists who are actually doing their research and their PhD theses on faith-based organizations and how they operate in Africa. So I don't know why it's taken so long to do this, but it's for those of you who think you go into graduate school, there's plenty of research to be done in that area.
Thank you. The last slide that you have. We're not hearing you.
It is all the way up.
I just don't want to miss anything you're saying, so maybe you can speak up so I can...
Fine, I'm saying about Tom from Uganda.
Which part?
Northern Uganda, yes.
From where?
Uganda.
Which part?
Northern Uganda.
Oh, great.
have just two questions. The first one is the last slide about the U.S. intervention in northern Uganda. As someone from Uganda or from northern Uganda, we wanted U.S. to intervene in that conflict earlier, much earlier, and there was no international intervention in that conflict. And I know very well that we have discovered oil in Uganda, and the United States came saying that they are going to intervene, they want to help us solve that problem. My question is, why is it that the United States is intervening in the conflict which was almost coming to an end because the Cuba peace talks of 2006? The second one is about the motive of the humanitarian assistance. I expected to say something about the crisis that is happening in northern Uganda, that is a disease called the nodding disease. I don't know whether you've heard about it.
What the?
Nodding disease. Have you heard?
Oh, the nodding disease.
Yes, I expected to say something about it.
Yes.
Now, the conspiracy is that the cause of this disease is a result of the humanitarian assistance that was being given there. Basically, the food was affecting the immune system of the children, that they cannot stand well, they have to be tied because they will fall down in the ditch or in the fire. And the theory is that there must be some sort of deducted traits. I don't know whether that's the right word. But the challenge is that we have about 200 children dead now, over 3,000 affected, and most of these people are children from only where there was the conflict, basically from IDP camps. What do you have to say about the motive of humanitarian assistance from international agencies? Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you for allowing me to say something about yes, the discovery of oil, the timing of this. I'm not an American, right? So I'm not, even if I were, I couldn't speak for the American government. But you're absolutely right. The timing is suspicious. Oil has been discovered in a region that also is partly Uganda, partly Sudan, and I think we've heard that it may be bigger than it was initially thought. So, is this the reason that the U.S. has weighed in a much more interventionist fashion than before? Possibly, yes. There are a lot of people that would say that, but I think it could also be. I mean, these are the invisible children. This one here. I don't know their names more, but this is John Prendergast, one of the most well-known humanitarian experts, was in the Clinton government. I mean, he's the head of the Enough project to stop genocide. I mean, we can't also take away from the fact that several people here are genuinely concerned about the fact that this region is not able to enjoy a sustainable peace because of the ongoing rebel activity, and the fear that this rebel activity may generate more rebel activity, and that it's an important region, not just for oil, but also for all the minerals that are there, right? Not far away in Democratic Republic of Congo, which has ongoing terrible civil conflicts. The mineral there that we all depend on is coltan, right? That's what drives our cell phones. And of course, that's not the reason that they give. I mean, they're talking about the regional stability. Some people say, no, but this is great. Finally, Africa is getting more recognition for its support in terms of solving some of its civil conflicts. but you're right to draw attention to this, and that this is some explanation. This is one of the explanations that people have given for this recent development. As for the nodding disease, I mean, it is a sort of mysterious illness, which I think is a version of epilepsy. Is that correct? It is medically speaking. But it's spreading, and again, outcry over why the government's not doing enough. Why aren't international medical teams there trying to? I mean, this is obviously a public health crisis. But what is interesting is the geography of it in relation to the camps, and is this linked to the food that they were given or something. So I don't know. I have not been following some of the theories for why this disease is occurring as it is occurring. So I'm sorry I can't be more informative than that, but you're absolutely right to note that even, you see, we're talking about the post-conflict situation. People are still interpreting their events in light of the marginalization, in light of the humanitarian intervention. So, the post-conflict situation is very much linked to the conflict situation and the history of Uganda and the relations with the West. Yes. Any more comments, questions? Three excellent questions.
Thank you very much. This is clearly a very complicated conversation that we could have for many, many more hours. Sadly, I'm going to draw the event to a close, and to give our formal thank you to our wonderful speaker this evening, I'm going to invite up our Vice President and Academic Dean, Dr. Jim Frank.
Dr. Hackett, thank you for a passionate presentation this evening, for sharing with us your experiences, your insights, struggles in Uganda, and for challenging us to come to a better understanding of these struggles and how we might assist ourselves in some way. We have a number of students off to Uganda this summer. We've had a number there in the past. I know our students this summer go much better prepared, and we look forward to hearing their stories. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. We really appreciate it. There are refreshments still left in the lobby, so please help yourself. And perhaps if there's some more questions you'd like to explore, you might be able to grab Rosalind before she goes home for the evening. As you may know, the full lecture schedule for the rest of the year is on our website. You just need to go to sju.ca, look for the Center for Responsible Citizenship, and then follow the links to the lectures. A brochure has been mailed, so if you haven't received yours, there are some of those out in the lobby as well. And again, there's also donation forms if you'd like to make a donation. The next lecture coming up will be Friday, March 9th, and that will be the very first Lawrence A. Cummings Lecture in Cultural History. It will be given by Michael Madden, who will be talking on Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral, Urbanism, Phenomenology, and the Sacred. It's a very long title, might sound a little scary, but he promises to show lots of pictures, which will be very interesting, and I hope to see you all back. Thanks again for coming out.